This panel is on income inequality, which is a very important point that has been one of the keynote points of the election, actually. Bernie Sanders declared, "Wealth and income inequality is the great moral issue of our time, the great economic issue of our time, and the great political issue of our time." Hillary Clinton, she's had 2 years of giving policy positions on income inequality. Her first public rally, she spoke about income inequality. And if you really want to, you can get on her YouTube campaign part, and she has a message saying she has a 40-year history of fighting inequality. Trump has not really spoken directly on any income inequality, but he has said he'd like to increase taxes on the rich. As Dr. Watson's pointed out, or will point out, that we may know about Thomas Piketty's book, which in 2014 was a New York Times bestseller, and it's over 650 pages long. So you wonder how in the world did that become a New York Times bestseller. But there's a big section in there on income inequality, and I think that's what sort of put it into the top, was this all discussion about how important it is to deal with inequality. Now, if we sort of think about it, all the people that differ in their particular efforts means that we're going to have a difference in inequality. As Ludwig von Mises pointed out in 1927 in a really interesting little book called Liberalism in the Classical Tradition, he said, "Those who advocate equality of income distribution overlook the most important point, namely that the total available for distribution, the annual product of social labor, is not independent of the manner in which it is divided." So what he's saying is, in a market capitalist system, why are we so rich? We're rich because of the social order. And we have a couple of panelists that have been with the Fraser Institute, and they have an index of economic freedom, and they have some nice graphs that show you when you relate economic freedom to poverty or other measures, we find that countries that have the highest level of economic freedom also have the highest level of wealth for the poor. So what we'd like to do today is to start go through an analysis of this inequality. In 2001, the National Bureau of Economic Research had a working paper and found that people who believe that if the American society allows for social mobility, people are more averse to income redistribution. And finally, as part of the 2016 economic debate, the issue of equal pay for women and men has come up. In fact, Hillary Clinton in April on Equal Pay Day said that she's going to use every tool to close the gap on this. So our three panelists are going to discuss each of these component parts. Scott is going to, of the Manhattan Institute, is going to look at social mobility in America, and Sally's going to look at the equal pay for equal work debate, and then finally Bill's going to talk about the question of whether we should care about inequality. So I'd like to begin the panel with our first speaker, Scott Winship. Dr. Winship has testified before Congress on poverty, inequality, and joblessness. He has a BA in sociology, which we won't hold against him, but BA in sociology and urban studies from Northwestern, and a PhD in social policy from Harvard, although my PhD is from Berkeley, so I can't really give him a bad time about Harvard. He served as a Walter Winston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and prior to that appointment, he was a fellow at the Brookings Institution. His research interests include living standards and economic mobility, inequality, and insecurity. He writes a column for Forbes.com, and his research has been widely published. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and he'll be discussing income mobility in the U.S. relative to other countries. So please help me in welcoming Scott Winship.
Thanks, Gary, for that great introduction. So I've changed the topic of my presentation a little bit based on some feedback, and what I really want to do is kind of give you just an overview of economic mobility in the United States, specifically intergenerational mobility, and to try to hone in on what I think are the problems that we should be concerned about versus things that are sort of distractions. You hear a lot of claims on this topic that just aren't accurate. And to distinguish it, I think, from what Bill's going to talk about, economic mobility and inequality are really two separate dimensions, right? You can imagine a society where we managed to compress the pay scale, for better or for worse, so that fast food workers and CEOs had very little difference in terms of what they were paid. You can call that society Denmark if you want. But that still could be a world where the daughter of a fast food worker can only aspire to be a fast food worker, right? And so that would be a society with very little inequality, but also very little intergenerational mobility. On the other hand, you could have a society where we let CEOs get really rich relative to fast food workers. You can call that the United States. But where there's more fluidity and the daughter of a fast food worker can also aspire to be a CEO. It turns out that's probably more reflective of Denmark than the United States, that part of it. But so you can just see where these two issues are really different dimensions, and I'm going to try to talk mostly about intergenerational mobility. So let's see the first slide. We don't have a clicker, do we? Oh, we do. Oh, great. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Okay, so first basic question, how much mobility do we have in the United States? This is a chart from the Pew Economic Mobility Project, where I worked 3 jobs ago, that essentially each bar represents a group of kids who started in a different part of the parental income distribution. Okay, so on the left, you have kids who were in the bottom fifth of parental income. And then within each of these bars, it's showing you where they end up. So that red section tells you that, and you can think of these as being about today's 45-year-olds, basically me. Where did they start out when they were kids, and where did they end up? So among today's 45-year-olds, if you start in the bottom fifth, you have about a 43% chance of ending up in the bottom fifth yourself, and this is all of family income. Now, is that good or bad, right? Different people can look at that number and think very differently about it. It means 3 and 5 made it out of the bottom, right? My own perspective is that that's true and that that's good. But if you sort of look at the higher bars and ask, if you grew up in the bottom fifth, what are the chances that you can make it to the middle class, for instance? And it turns out you only have only 30% of today's 45-year-olds that started in the bottom made it to the middle class or higher. Okay, if your family background made no difference at all, that number would be 60%, because you'd have a 20% chance of ending up in the bottom fifth, you'd have a 20% chance of ending up in the second fifth, 20% chance. So about half of what it would be if family background made no difference at all. Now on the other end, on the right, you have kids who start in the top fifth, and you can see there's a parallel situation there where if you start at the top, 40% of today's 45-year-olds that started there remain there, and it's very rare to fall down to the bottom or bottom 2/5. In the middle, there's a lot more fluidity. You can see those bars are each much closer to 20%, which would be perfect statistical mobility. Whether that would be perfect mobility in a normative sense, I think, is a much tougher question. But there is a lot of fluidity within the middle 3/5. Now, one thing I should say is that if another way to think about mobility is just to ask, did you end up better off than your parents in real terms? So regardless of if you stayed in the bottom fifth, maybe everybody got richer over time, and so even if you were stuck in the bottom fifth, you still end up better off in a material sense. And the United States looks a lot better in that regard. It turns out that about 84% of today's 45-year-olds are better off in an absolute sense after you account for inflation than their parents were. If you start in the bottom, it's about 93% ended up better off. So we look better there. And in fact, because of the way we've gotten richer over time, an adult today could actually be one of the richer people in the bottom fifth, and that would have been enough to sneak them into the middle fifth in their parents' generation. So that's a pretty interesting way to think about remaining stuck in the bottom on one level is a bad thing, but materially it also means you're probably quite a bit better off than in the past. Okay. Oh, and another interesting figure, the median 45-year-old, if you ask what change in income did they experience between adolescence and adulthood, turns out the median is a 93% increase in income, which sounds ridiculously high, especially when you see figures that the median household income in the U.S. has only increased by about 40% since, say, 1979. And the way to square that circle is that there are a lot of people at the bottom for whom doubling your parents' income it turns out to leave you still pretty low income. But nevertheless, it remains the case that a lot of people do end up quite a bit better off than their parents in percentage terms. Okay, so second question. It's really hard to think about those levels of mobility without having some sort of reference point, right? If it turns out that in the U.S. 40% are stuck there, but in every other country it's 80%, then we would look pretty good. If it turns out in other countries it's more like 20%, we look pretty bad. Or if things have gotten worse over time, that would be another way to evaluate how much mobility that we've got. So first question is just, is the U.S. worse than other countries? This is a chart that some of you may be familiar with called the Great Gatsby curve, and this is where my talk dips a little bit into income inequality. The most common measure used to look at cross-national differences in economic mobility is this measure called the intergenerational elasticity. And since most of you are economists, this is basically just the coefficient on a regression of parents' logged, fathers' logged earnings, or sons' logged earnings on fathers' logged earnings. Okay, so it's telling you how important for your own earnings in adulthood were your father's earnings in some sense. And if you just look at the vertical scale of this chart, that tells you where these countries rank. So higher is worse. It means more persistence between generations. And you can see the United States, if you look at that first dot that's by the words United States, tends to have less mobility by this measure than other countries. Tends to be at the high end with the United Kingdom. Italy is not on this chart, but typically you see Italy up there. And in contrast, towards the bottom of the chart, you tend to see the Scandinavian and Nordic countries. Canada, it turns out, typically is also pretty far down. And so a lot of times you hear people say the American dream is alive and well in Canada, which is I'll get to in a moment, is actually not a great characterization of the truth on this stuff. Now, if you move from left to right on the chart, that's a measure of income inequality. And so this is a chart that was created by Alan Krueger when he was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in President Obama's first term, to basically argue that as inequality in the United States has grown and continues to grow, that it's going to hurt economic mobility and has hurt economic mobility. And you can see this little path that he charted out for the U.S., which is based on that best fitting line between all of these dots in this chart. So he said in the United States, inequality was along the lines of 0.35. Today it's around 0.4. This is a Gini coefficient for people who are familiar with inequality stats. And therefore, mobility is going to worsen. Well, as we'll get to in a second, that went against pretty much all of the evidence that we have that actually mobility hasn't declined in the United States. But the point that I've made about this chart is that there's a lot of imprecision in the mobility estimates in the chart. And specifically, there's an interesting feature of the intergenerational elasticity, which is that if inequality rises between father and son generations, then it makes mobility look worse. So it's sort of a weird measure of mobility if rising inequality makes it look worse. And if rising inequality makes this measure of mobility look worse, it's perhaps not surprising that there's a pretty strong relationship across countries between how much inequality a country has and how much mobility it has. A different measure of mobility strips out the impact of inequality on mobility and looks at where people rank versus where their fathers ranked. When you do that, it turns out, so I should back up and say this chart was created by an economist named Miles Korak. I'm not sure where he is now. He was a Canadian economist. I think he's at Harvard right now. So Miles Korak created this to show that inequality was bad. A couple years ago, he put out a paper very quietly, which he's never cited, where he measured mobility for the United States, Canada, and Sweden, but he used this rank measure that strips out the mechanical effect of inequality on this chart. Turns out the United States and Sweden and Canada essentially have the same mobility levels in terms of rank, if you have a pure mobility measure, which is a shocking finding. He clearly is not pleased with it. Nevertheless, it's probably the best cross-national study that's ever been done because it was done by a Canadian, American, and Swedish economist, each working with their own data and working together to make the data sets as comparable as possible. Okay, and then before moving on, I should say, so that's all comparing sons' earnings and fathers' earnings. There's less written on daughters' earnings to sons, daughters' earnings to fathers' earnings, or to mothers' earnings. And the main reason for that, there are a lot of reasons for that, some of them not so great, but the main reason for it is just that it's very hard to interpret these intergenerational mobility stats for women, given the massive changes in labor force participation that occurred over this period. But if you look instead at the relationship between parental family income, so not just father earnings, but includes mother's earnings, non-earnings income that the family has, family income versus son's income, the U.S. probably is worse than other countries in that regard, even if you use a pure measure of mobility. There's not great data on it yet, so it's a little bit of an open question, but at this point I think you'd have to say that it looks like we have worse income mobility than other countries. And that raises questions about the importance of family structure, and I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, the other evidence that you typically see cited to show that the U.S. has worse mobility than other countries is a paper by a team led by Marcus Jäntti, who's a very good Finnish economist. And he had a paper that showed this is if you start in the bottom fifth, what are the chances that you remain in the bottom fifth in adulthood? And you can see the U.S. looks pretty bad here, a 40% chance, just as we saw in the Pew slides, versus these other countries where it's not quite so bad. The problem here is that for all these other countries, for the Nordic countries, he was comparing father earnings to son's earnings. For the United States, that number actually compares parent family income to son's earnings. That was something he didn't realize at the time was important. Since then, we've actually got some evidence on what the number is for sons versus fathers' earnings in the United States from the Korak paper I just mentioned and from somewhere else. And so I've changed the bars here for the U.S. and for Sweden based on this Miles Korak paper. And you can see they come quite a bit closer together, mostly because now that U.S. figure does compare father and son's earnings. It uses administrative data. They took very great care to make the Swedish and the U.S. numbers comparable. So you can see they get very close together, which implies that probably if you took the same care in looking at mobility in Norway and Finland, that you would see a similar compression to some extent in Denmark. Denmark, I think, is sort of a little bit of a different planet. But it shows you that the differences between the U.S. and these other countries is probably smaller than what we thought. And in particular, this idea that if you really want to pursue the American dream, go to Canada is probably not right. The other thing is that this measure of absolute mobility, do end up better off than your parents in real terms. We don't have good comparisons of that for other countries. So it might also be that we look a lot better than other nations in terms of absolute mobility. Okay, is U.S. mobility worse than in the past? This is a claim you hear all the time from left and right. So last year you had a book by Robert Putnam called Our Kids that argued that mobility had fallen in the United States and that this was terrible. It would be terrible if it was true. But also Charles Murray has written as well that mobility is on the decline in the United States. And it just goes against the consensus from academic research. So you look at earnings and income mobility, for instance. There was a great study by Raj Chetty, who won the Clark Medal for being the smartest economist under 40. I think he was 40. I think he was 28 when he won it, so he had years to spare. He found that there was no change in intergenerational mobility. That got a lot of attention, but it really reaffirmed 20 years of research, 10 studies using a data set called the PSID, where they almost always found either no decline or a small increase in mobility. A different data set called the National Longitudinal Survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out has found declines in mobility between men born in the late 1940s and men born in the early 1960s. I'm working on that question as well with that data, and I find the same thing, except that I find mobility actually increasing between the men born in the early 60s, and now there's another data set of men born in the early 80s. So if you believe the NLS that things got worse over these first two generations, then you also have to believe they got better over the most recent two. I actually don't really believe any of that. I think probably this data set with the early 1960s cohorts is probably a little hinky. And that probably the safest conclusion is that there hasn't been much change either way. There's this other paper that used decennial census data that is a little bit too clever by half. They don't actually observe fathers and sons of their fathers and what their earnings were when they were kids. Okay, and then the occupational mobility literature and educational mobility literature are, the occupational mobility literature is vast. It's what sociologists tend to study rather than economists. And I share the disdain for most sociologists, I would say. But it pretty consistently finds that there haven't been big changes in occupational mobility in the United States either. Same for educational mobility, very mixed evidence. So again, it's the consensus is that we may not have enough economic mobility in the United States, which is my position actually, but it's not gotten worse over time. Some people say, well, but it could get worse, right? Everything I've told you about is for today's 45-year-olds. What about today's 5-year-olds? Are they going to have worse mobility when they're 45? Possibly. That's certainly the argument that Putnam and Murray make. And it's easy to list a number of worrisome trends that would lead you to think mobility is on the decline. There's a whole other set of indicators that have gotten better over time that I think counterbalance that and that don't get attention that I can talk more about in Q&A if folks are interested. But the bottom line is, looks like things haven't gotten worse. Okay, so what's the problem? Here's the problem to me, a lot of what I write tends to be along the lines of, well, things are not as bad as you think, and if everything's a problem, then nothing's a problem, right? What I think gets obscured in a lot of the talk about mobility is that there's this big black-white gap in mobility in the United States. If you start with the men's earnings line, that's the fourth set of bars down. That blue bar tells you that if you group all men together, that 34% of those who start in the bottom fifth of family income remained in the bottom fifth of male earnings when they got to adulthood, roughly 45 years old. But you can see the differences between blacks and whites there is pretty staggering. For white men, it's 25% chance of remaining stuck in the bottom. Remember, if family background had no impact whatsoever, that number would be 20. So that's basically Denmark, right? 25% is what we saw for Denmark. For African-American men, on the other hand, twice as high, basically 50%. Half of black men who start in the bottom of family income remain there as adults. For women, the story is very different, and I was astonished when I crunched these numbers. So these numbers I've done myself. For white women, well, first of all, for women, mobility is a little worse than it is for men, regardless of race. But still, better than the 40% that we saw in some of those charts. So if you're a white woman, you start in the bottom fifth of family income, about a 30% chance that you remain there. For black women, though, it's basically the same. So black and white women are basically just as likely to escape the bottom fifth of family income as each other, which is striking compared to the men. Now if you move up to the third line, or the second line, which is family income for men. So it's what's the likelihood, given that you start in the bottom fifth of family income, that you end up in the bottom fifth of family income. Again, for white men, that's 20%, incredibly high mobility. For black men, it's, again, 50%. For women this time, though, you see that mobility for black women is also terrible, in fact, worse than for black men. And again, this raises this distinction between earnings mobility and family income mobility. How are those results consistent? Well, first of all, marriage rates differ greatly between blacks and whites in the United States. If you're not married, that's a potential earner that isn't there to raise your income. But it's also the case that black men are doing so poorly that if your marriage pool is mostly made up of, if you're a black woman starting at the bottom and your marriage pool is disproportionately black men who start at the bottom, even if you marry, earnings from black men are going to help you get out of the bottom quite a bit less than if you're white. So one way to take a look and try to distinguish, just about out of time, between those two stories is a little experiment I did where I took everyone who didn't get married at age 45, and since I see them in adolescence, I see them with their brothers, and so I actually married them off to their brothers, which sounds perverse. But essentially, it's a way to say, well, the marriage pool for these women, is probably guys that are like their brothers growing up, right? And so when you do that, you move from these middle bars where you see a big 31% to 57% gap in family income mobility for black women and white women. If you marry everybody off, you get this bottom set of bars, and that gets narrowed to 30% versus 45%. So a chunk of the black-white gap goes away, but a pretty big gap remains. So marriage can't be the whole story. I think another thing that these numbers obscure is just that African-American 45-year-olds are far, far more likely to have started in the bottom. So everything I showed you was conditional on starting in the bottom, right? But it's the case that half of today's 45-year-old African Americans start in the bottom versus just 13% for whites. So to me, this issue of black-white differences in mobility is really the thing that we ought to be focused on as a country. It's been 50 years since the civil rights movement. It's pretty embarrassing, I think, that we still have this sort of inequality today. I'll sit with that.
Our next speaker is Sally Pipes. She's president and chief executive officer of the Pacific Research Institute, which is a San Francisco-based think tank, founded in 1979. So we've got Harvard, San Francisco, Berkeley. He's at least okay. Prior to that, she was assistant director of the Fraser Institute. She addresses national and international audiences on healthcare issues, and she's been interviewed on ABC's 2020 with John Stossel, CNN's Lou Dobbs Show, Fox News, The Glenn Beck Show, NBC's Nightly News with Brian Williams, and other prominent programs.
I said he's no longer there. Brian Williams.
Right. I'm going to blame that on Anita.
Yeah.
Okay. That's right. Well, he was there.
Yes, no, I know.
Yes, he was there. She serves as a columnist at Forbes.com and has written for the Examiner newspapers, Investors Business Daily, Wall Street Journal, and a host of other newspapers. She's been invited to testify before the United States Congress, most recently in front of the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, their subcommittee on primary health and aging. She's the author of numerous publications, including The Top 10 Myths of American Healthcare, A Citizen's Guide, and Miracle Cure, How to Solve America's Healthcare Crisis and Why Canada Isn't the Answer. Ms. Pipes, a former Canadian, became an American citizen in 2006. She'll be discussing why gender pay gaps are no evidence of discrimination. So help me in thanking Sally to the...
Just before we start, can we, this is not the beginning of my slide presentation, this is the end. So we need to go, it's back to front, so we need to go to, don't start my time yet. So.
Take it out of my time.
There we are, good. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's great to be back speaking before Hillsdale and the CCA. In 1974, Sir Anthony Fisher, the founder of the Pacific Research Institute, published a book entitled Must History Repeat Itself? A study of the lessons taught by the repeated failure and occasional success of government economic policy through the ages. Edna St. Vincent Malloy said in answer to that question, history doesn't repeat itself, it's the same damn thing over and over again. Fisher's question applies to the current debate over the gender pay gap. And I thought I'd put this to bed back in around 2007 and I could get involved in Obamacare, but anyway, it's back. For the past half century, there have been questions about why men, on average, have higher earnings than women. All Americans would agree that women deserve equal pay for equal work. Who could argue against the moral principle of fairness, of equal treatment? Over 50 years ago, the U.S. government codified these principles into law. Both the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64 put restrictions on compensation discrimination based on sex. The Equal Pay Act specifically prohibits employers from paying workers of one sex less than that is paid to another for jobs requiring equal work, equal effort, and responsibility. One would think that such laws would have put to rest the issue of gender-based pay discrimination. However, as Sir Anthony Fisher might have predicted, a number of political leaders, activists, and scholars continue to argue that women are systematically paid less than men for no other reason than their gender. Equality of opportunity to them is just not enough. They want equality of outcomes as well, no matter how unjust. Let's call this view the discrimination hypothesis. The main piece of evidence? The Census Bureau's so-called gender earnings ratio. According to the Bureau's most recent calculation from 2015, a typical woman earns 79.6% as much as a man. Slide 2. Next slide. President Obama points to this 79.6% number as proof that pay discrimination is a real and persistent problem that continues to shortchange American women and their families. He has referred to the existence of a gender gap as an embarrassment. In the first presidential debate, I don't know, 1 million Americans watched it, maybe you did, Hillary Clinton made a similar call, pressing for equal pay for women's work. Of course, President Obama and Mrs. Clinton might want to get their own houses in order. Next slide. One study found that the average female White House staffer made 84% of what the average male staffer did in 2015. Another group looked into Hillary Clinton's Family Foundation and found that it pays male executives 38% more than female executives. Nevertheless, President Obama, former Secretary of State Clinton, and other prominent progressives have pushed to implement measures intended to make gender-based pay discrimination far more difficult. Nationally, they have supported legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would strengthen the Equal Pay Act in hopes of shrinking that gap. And on the state level, in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, the just elected Republican governor of the state, I found this amazing that he would do this, starting in July of 2018, the measure will prohibit employers from requesting a pay history from preventing employers from asking for a pay history from prospective workers. And it also allows workers to discuss with each other how much they are being paid. The arguments behind such reforms suffer from the same basic flaw. The mere existence of a pay gap between men and women isn't by itself evidence of discrimination, nor is a pay gap cause for moral condemnation or, as the president said, embarrassment. There are perfectly defensible reasons for paying one person more than paying another. These important factors are experience, number of hours worked, the choice of occupation and industry that you go into. These all account for the disparity between men and women's earnings. Next slide, please. Or take quantity of work performed. The governing bodies of professional tennis have faced criticisms from the likes of Billie Jean King for allowing tournaments to pay men more than women. So partially in response to this, the 4 slams, Wimbledon, the Australian, the French Open, and the US Open, now pay females the same amount as they're paying males, the same prize money. However, in the slams, women's tennis is the best of 3 sets, while men's tennis is the best of 5 sets. For women tennis players, the drive appears to be for equal pay for less work. And as a former competitive tennis player, I never thought that I should be, well, I wasn't paid, but that women should be paid the same as men because it's much less strenuous paying the best of 3 than the best of 5. To the extent that women are paid less than men, it's largely because of free choices made by individual workers. Choices about which industries to enter, when to start a family, which jobs to pursue, and how much time to devote to those jobs. These findings not only disprove that women are victims of systematic pay discrimination, they demonstrate that statistics about a gender wage gap have little to say about the kinds of equality that truly matter. Next slide, please. The impact of career choice on female earnings. It's a simple fact that some workers in our economy earn more than others. I bet Bill makes more than I do.
I get paid in Canadian dollars.
Oh, yeah. And I get paid in American. These wage disparities aren't always the result of injustices. The surgeons are generally better compensated than mail carriers or babysitters. It isn't usually cause for moral outrage. It's uncontroversial that workers in different industries and occupations earn different wages for legitimate reasons. It's reasonable to ask, then, to what degree workers' choice of industry and occupation accounts for the current gender gap. The answer, next slide, please. It accounts for over half of the gender pay gap. According to one study from Cornell University, 50.5% of the gender gap can be attributed to industry and occupation alone. The data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics supports this figure. Among the most common occupations for women are secretary and admin assistant, elementary and middle school teacher, nursing, psychiatric, and home aid worker. The average annual pay for those women positions is $39,000, $58,000, and $25,500 respectively. Men are far more likely to hold higher paying jobs like software applications engineer, personal finance advisor, and chemical engineer. All of those positions average over $100,000 a year. Next slide, please. In fact, women make up 3/4 of the nation's 10 lowest wage occupations, according to an analysis from the National Women's Law Center, not known as a conservative organization. The wage gap is largely the product of a skills gap, specifically a math skills gap. And I remember after high school that people used to make fun of me. They called me the math genius. And for a girl, it was really intimidating. But now I'm glad that I did not contribute to the gap. Those well-compensated male-dominated positions all require highly attuned math skills. The representative, low-paying, female-dominated jobs do not. These figures complicate the claim made by pay equity activists that women systematically fail to receive equal pay for equal work. To a significant extent, women earn less than men because they are drawn to different careers than men. There's little to suggest that the low wages in these professions are a result of deliberate discrimination against women, rather than a fairly mundane choice of different pay for different work. Next slide, please. Time and experience matter more than gender. The difference between male and female workers extends to factors like life experience and hours worked. As with career choice, these are exactly the kinds of variables that would be expected to influence wages, regardless of one's gender. In 2011, the gap in work experience between men and women was 1.4 years. Researchers found that this disparity in labor experience accounted for more than 14% of the gender pay gap. Next slide, please. Add this figure to the effects of occupation and industry, and nearly 2/3 of the pay gap is attributable to factors that have absolutely nothing to do with overt discrimination. Historically, women haven't just worked fewer hours than worked fewer years, they've tended to work fewer hours. The average employed male put in 5% more time on the job than the average employed female in 2015. Moreover, compared to women, a greater share of full-time male work, they work on the average Saturday, Sunday, and holiday. I tend to do that myself too. Compare the average hourly wages of women and men, and the earnings ratio jumps from 78.6% to nearly 85%. And that's before factoring in variables like occupation and industry. Men are also more likely than women to work 50 hours or more per week, a disparity that has remained relatively constant over the past 30 years. Pulling long hours has become more common in recent decades, and the hourly returns for doing so have therefore increased. Consequently, one joint study from researchers at Indiana University and at Cornell found that 10% of the gender wage gap was attributable to male-dominated overwork. Next slide, please. Motherhood. This is a very important variable. The time and experience gap raises an obvious question. Why do women tend to be less experienced and less likely to work long hours than men? There really is no simple answer, but both trends are certainly related to the choice of many women to become mothers. Women who have children are compelled to spend less time working, sacrificing work experience and productivity gains in the process. Next slide, please. These sacrifices are reflected in the wage gap between mothers and non-mothers. In 2014, women made 83 cents for every dollar made by a man. But as Ivanka Trump said, noted in her speech at the Republican National Convention this year, single women without children earned 94% for each dollar earned by a man, whereas married women with married mothers made only 77 cents. Fact checkers, however, after the convention said the figure was not 77 cents, but it was actually 81 cents. But really, the point is actually the same. A University of Massachusetts sociologist recently estimated that women experience a 6.7% wage penalty for every child they have. A great deal of this motherhood penalty, she found, resulted from factors such as reduction in the number of hours worked. In many cases, mothers affirmatively choose to work fewer hours in order to devote more time and energy to raising their children. According to a 2012 study from the Pew Research Center, 62% of working mothers prefer to work part-time. Nearly 90% believe that having a full-time working mother is less than ideal for raising children. These preferences help explain why women are more likely to work part-time than men. In 2015, women accounted for nearly 2/3 of all part-time work in this country. Among parents, working mothers are 5 times more likely to be working in part-time positions than working fathers. The desire of mothers to work less can even be seen among highly trained professionals. A study about the wage gap between men and women who graduated from the top business schools in this country concluded that the presence of children is the main contributor to the lesser job experience, greater career discontinuity, and shorter work hours for female MBAs. Mothers, in other words, disproportionately are willing to forego paid work in the professional sphere for unpaid work at home. Next slide, please. By focusing solely on the wage discrepancy between men and women, the debate over gender pay equity often fails to recognize non-monetary benefits, but still valuable benefits many working women enjoy, usually disproportionately more than men. In a 2008 analysis, 2 economists found that women are more likely than men to receive family-friendly wage benefits from their employer. These benefits include such things as parental leave, sick leave, childcare, and a more flexible work schedule. After taking total compensation, including non-wage compensation, into consideration, the disparity between male and female earnings shrinks considerably. Next slide, please. One study found that the average value of compensation, including fringe benefits, for women totaled 96.4% of the average compensation earned by men. Fringe benefits, in other words, can account for nearly the entire wage gap by themselves. Next slide, please. Region and race. 2 other variables affect the male-female wage gap. They are region and race. From state to state, for instance, the gender earnings ratio can range from 90% in the District of Columbia to 65% in the state of Louisiana. There are also wide variations in the gender earnings ratio between race and ethnic groups. Next slide, please. Median earnings for Hispanic women total 89% of those for Hispanic men. The gender earnings ratio for Asian Americans, meanwhile, is 77.9%. Again, these raw earnings ratios don't reflect factors like occupation, hours worked, and fringe benefits. Nevertheless, the race and region together can account for 4.6% of the gender earnings gap. Next slide, please. So adding it all up, the next slide, please. Adding it all up, these factors, career choice, experience, hours worked, motherhood, fringe benefits, they all provide some degree of explanation for these earnings discrepancies. Take the computation of compensation data from PayScale. The firm compared the earnings of men and women working in the same job, controlling for variables like education, hours worked, experience, and location. Next slide, please. Their analysis put the estimated gender pay gap at only 2.7% less than men. Even studies championed by pay equity activists find the earnings ratio to be fairly small. Next slide, please. 2 Cornell researchers who controlled for the differences in industry, race, region, work experience between men and women yielded an adjusted gender pay gap of only 8.4% in 2010, a whole lot lower than that ratio, that embarrassing ratio mentioned by President Obama. So next slide, please. So where is the evidence of gender discrimination? The discrimination hypothesis suffers from a conspicuous lack of positive evidence. If our economy were truly infected with gender pay discrimination, one would expect to hear many more complaints about discrimination. Next slide, please. Yet in a 2013 survey by Pew, only 1 in 10 women ever complained that they were paid less than their male counterparts for doing the same job. A more recent Harris poll showed that the vast majority of workers, 70%, say that their own employer pays men and women equally. Next slide, please. At the core of the debate over the gender pay gap are 2 distinct conceptions of equality. For proponents of pay equity reform, the goal is equality of earnings. Only when the typical woman earns precisely the same as the typical man will these activists be satisfied. Anything short of a 1-to-1 ratio is prima facie morally wrong. The next slide, please. The next slide. Right. There's our friend Hayek. Friedrich Hayek captured this sentiment when he said there is a difference in the world between treating people equally and attempting to make them equal. For the most part, the unadjusted earnings gap ratio reflects choices by women to exercise these freedoms differently than men generally do. Far from being evidence of social dysfunction, the ratio, together with analyses presented in my paper, suggests that our nation's women are more empowered than ever to build careers suited to their needs, preferences, and values. That's not a moral failing, it's a hard-won victory. Thank you.
Our next speaker is William Watson. He was born and raised in Canada. Dr. Watson was educated at McGill and Yale and has taught at McGill since 1977. He's the current chairman of the Department of Economics there and also served as chairman between 2005 and 2010. He's best known for his regular columns in the National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, and for his appearances on Canadian radio and television. From 1998 to 2002, he edited Policy Options Politique. I think I got that right. Is that close? Not very French, but the magazine of Montreal's Institute for Research on Public Policy, where he's currently a senior research fellow. He's also a research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto and a senior fellow at Vancouver's Fraser Institute. His book, Globalization and the Meaning of Canadian Life, was runner-up for the Donner Prize for the best book on Canadian public policy issues in 1998. His latest book, The Inequality Trap, Fighting Capitalism Instead of Poverty, was shortlisted for the National Business Book Award in 2016. He'll be discussing whether we want inequality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Watson.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. This is my first visit to the Free Market Forum. I've heard about it. Let me congratulate you on being here on a Friday when you could be playing golf, I guess, and the organizers for the high quality of the presentations so far. The question I was assigned, do we want income inequality? Just so it's clear, my answer is I don't care about inequality. What I want is fairness or equity. So do we want income inequality? Neither here nor there. The way I'm going to tell this story, I've got a subtitle, Piketty and Me. Thomas Piketty is very well known. This is his book, Capital in the 21st Century, a bestseller on the New York Times list. He got on the cover of Business Week and he's been the talk of Washington and Paris, where he's from, and around the world, really, for his discussion of inequality in this 650-page book. There's something called the Hawking Index, tracked by Amazon. Amazon can tell how far you've gotten into a book. And the record used to be held by Stephen Hawking, Brief History of Time. For me, the Brief History of Time was extremely brief because I only got about 6 pages in. And Piketty has taken over from that. Most people, it seems, read the first chapter, which gives you the gist of the story, and then stop. I got all the way through. I think it's a terrific book. I disagree with almost everything he says, but it's a wonderful read, and if you do get through to the end, I think it repays the reading. This is a tale of 2 books. This other book here is my book, The Inequality Trap, which you probably just heard of when it was mentioned. It got a favorable mention in the New York Times. I know around here that doesn't count for much, but the reviewer said although the presentation or the arguments were familiar, the presentation was lively and able. Lively and able is how we think of my 91-year-old mother. But that's, it was the New York Times, and they spelled my name right, so there you go. Now, if you look at the 2 together, you notice a certain similarity. I didn't notice this until about 6 months after my book had been published. The color scheme is basically the same. I phoned up the publisher and said, University of Toronto Press, by the way. You can get it on Amazon. By the miracle of Kindle, you could be halfway through the first chapter by the time I finish speaking. The color scheme is the same. I said, is this an accident? They said, of course not. Of course it's not an accident. They wanted to play off of Piketty because I talk about Piketty to a certain extent. But unfortunately, you can't sell a book by its cover. And here are some data on book sales. That's Piketty. There's me. Did you see it? Did you see it happen? It's kind of... My latest sales, I checked the end of September, 1,486 books. The publisher's happy. And I'm only, 1.499 million behind Piketty. Do we want inequality? I guess yes, but just not quite so much of it. I'd like a bigger share of the book market. There's Piketty. With so many book sales, you'd look relaxed like that, wouldn't you? He's younger now because of all those book sales. What he says, inequality is, and I agree with this. This is one page of the book I do agree with. Inequality is not necessarily bad in itself. The key question is to decide whether it is justified. And I think that's the whole story about inequality. That's from the book itself. Is the inequality of his 1.5 million sales versus my 1,486, is the inequality of, I don't know what his royalty is. My cumulative royalty as of the end of September was 2190.58.
Canadian?
And those are Canadian dollars. Is that inequality justified? Alas, I think it is justified. Would Piketty agree that it's justified? I'm not sure he would agree that it's justified. Piketty doesn't discuss his book and his royalties and so on and in the book, but he does talk about income and the morality of income. And he talks about capital income in particular. And he argues that virtually all income from capital consists of 3 parts. True entrepreneurial labor, Steve Jobs type labor. Pure luck, which certainly happens. We know that in business, that sometimes you get lucky. Steve Jobs was not very lucky in the 1980s. He was terrifically lucky in the first decade of this century, more or less with the same ideas, but his time had not come in the 1980s. It had come in the first decade of this century. And outright theft. I'm not sure that's a big component of too many people's capital income, but he argues at least some. He says it's very hard to figure it out. He talks about Carlos Slim. He talks about Bill Gates, not to cast any aspersions on Bill Gates. He doesn't know how they earned their income. He can't judge the morality of their income. And so the approach that he takes is one that's essentially agnostic about their income. I'd like to investigate that a little bit by talking about Piketty's book, or my book, True Entrepreneurial Labor. Well, he's been studying this stuff for 15 years. He's put together a tremendous database, he and several others, from whom he didn't really steal anything. And he wrote a 680-page book, and it's been very successful. He's a terrific storyteller. He's a very good translator. It was originally written in French. Pure luck. Sure, he's probably had some pure luck. The topic, he's been working on it for 15, 20 years, and it became a very hot topic, partly through his efforts, but partly independently. Occupy Wall Street came along in 2011. People's concern about inequality was lucky for people who write about inequality. I guess I've had a little luck too, but just not quite as much luck as he's had. Outright theft, well, we all stand on the shoulders of the people who invented the language. We have stolen the language in that way, but it's not clear to me that he has, in fact, stolen any ideas. And so in his case, it's probably true entrepreneurial luck. He argues that, in fact, a lot of high incomes, if not all high incomes, are not earned. They're not the result of effort, but they are, in fact, in large part pure luck. They are what economists would call a rent. A rent is income that you don't actually need in order to do what you're doing, right? And of course, the one consequence of people earning lots of rents is that you can take the rents away from them and they don't change their behavior. If you don't need it to do what you're doing, you'll probably keep doing what you're doing, even if a lot of the income is taken away. Did Piketty write that book thinking, I'm going to sell 1.5 million copies and I'm going to make, I don't know, royalty, $3 a copy, $4 a copy, more than that? He's got movie rights as well. There's going to be a documentary made on the basis of his book. I don't know what the movie rights are for a documentary on the basis of your book. I do hope to find out. If anybody wants to option my book, we can talk after the presentation. Suppose Piketty's income were pure rent, and I don't think most incomes are pure rent, but suppose those incomes are pure rent. Should we take it from him? And could we take it from him? How do you go around the economy figuring out what's a rent and what's not a rent? On the first question, should we take it from him? If it's a pure rent, it's fallen out of the sky, it's absolute luck, you might think, well, why don't we take that? The state comes along and you're not going to change your behavior. You'll be worse off, of course, because you like to have the millions of dollars, but you're not going to change your behavior. And there are so many needs elsewhere in society that should be answered. Well, there's a nice paper that's just come out, NBER paper by Matthew Weinzierl. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. Apologies to Matthew, who's at the Harvard Business School. And he conducted this online survey describing a little experiment, what he calls a brute luck lottery. There are two people. They buy a lottery ticket, costs $18,000, substantial purchase. But what they get is person A wins $60,000, person B wins $30,000. They don't know in advance whether they're going to be A or B, right? So you figure out who's going to buy the ticket, what the cost sharing is going to be, and then you're told who's going to be A and who's going to be B. Right? The pure utilitarian, that is mainstream public finance, Samuelsonian type argument, is they should just split the net returns. Right? That's the smart thing to do, and maybe it's the social welfare optimal thing to do. If they've each got declining marginal utility, how do you equalize marginal utility? Give them both the same income, right? So, and Weinstraw conducts a survey of people online to ask what is the fair way to split this. And the utilitarian way is person A, who gets the $60,000, pays the full cost, plus also pays $6,000 to person B, thus equalizing their return. Right? And if you gave this to public finance economists of a certain type, at least, utilitarians, they would probably come up with this answer. And he sort of, in the survey, points people. It's a paid survey. You get $3. It's a 10-minute survey. You get $3 to fill it out. It's closed, unfortunately. So, but if you go to his website, I'm sure he has others going, and maybe that's a more profitable use of the next 10 minutes. I don't know. We'll see. What do people in general think should be the division? You know, who gets 60 and who gets 30 is purely arbitrary, and there's no effort involved. It's a pure luck lottery. The survey says person A, who gets the 60, should pay more of the cost. Right? Shouldn't pay, the answer isn't 18,000 plus 6,000. There are some people in the survey that say that, but fewer than 20%, if I remember correctly. Most people say that A shouldn't even pay the full $18,000. I think the average is about $14,000 that A should pay, but B should pay something else. So this is money that's, if ever there was a rent, this is a rent, completely accidental. You did nothing in the 2 minutes participation in the lottery to earn the rent in any moral sense of earn, but people still tend to think it's A's rent, right? It's A's money evidently counts for something. So even if all those high incomes are rents, which I don't believe, people in general, or at least the 2,500 people who participated in the $3 online survey, tend to think ownership of the money counts. It doesn't count for everything, but it certainly counts for something. So it's Piketty's money, even if he was lucky. And I don't necessarily have the right to go and take Piketty's money just to make up for the fact that my sales are somewhat insufficient. Could we take it from him? You know, if you believe there's lots of rents in society or there's lots of pure theft in society, how do you go about dealing with that? Through a tax system. Well, I have a new simplified tax form that you could fill out. Line 1, how much of your income did you not need in order to perform the economic activity that generated it? Line 2, pay that amount. I figure only Swedish Quakers are going to tell you the truth about how much money they needed to do whatever it was that they were doing. So there's great impracticality in putting together a tax system that simply says, okay, people at the top end, tell us your rents, or we're going to go after rents. I don't know how you do it. One Canadian study looked at the top 1% in Canada and found that something like 11% were in the natural resource industries. That's smaller now after the decline in the price of oil. And something like 18% were in the finance, insurance, and real estate industries, which we call the FIRE industries, because that's what they're really good at starting. So they concluded, well, those two industries, they must be rents, because natural resources, we know that there are rents there, and these people must just be skimming the rents off of the oil deposits and the natural gas deposits and so on. And the finance people, well, we know they're rents because, you know, finance isn't worth anything. And so anything that you earn in that industry must be a rent. Well, that seems a little crude to me. And I don't think we should have a special tax for resources or for the finance industry. Check the box. If you work in finance, pay 10% more on your income tax. So this off with their heads, off with all their heads approach strikes me as not useful. Right? So Piketty's approach is the fiscal approach. He recommends big increases in marginal income tax rates, up to possibly 80%. He's not very precise in his policy recommendations. That's okay. It's a big book. It's not a blueprint for every country. He also talks about a world wealth tax of maybe 5%, maybe 10%. I think those are literally his words. Not terribly precise again, but you get the idea. So the fiscal approach is we're going to somehow we'll get all the fat, and we're not going to attack any of the muscle by doing it this way. Tax it all: the good, the bad, the ugly. Me, what do? I worry about poverty, not inequality. What's happening down at the bottom concerns me more than what's happening up at the top. And I don't think it's what's happening up at the top that is causing what's happening down at the bottom, right? And in fact, by most measures, certainly in Canada, to a somewhat lesser extent in the U.S., poverty measures are getting better. Even post-crash, poverty rates in Canada fell a little bit. They've since gone up a little bit, but they're lower than they were 25 years ago. The U.S. data is a little messier, but I think that's probably true in the United States as well. So that's an encouraging argument about what to do. Let's go after poverty. We've had success in going after poverty. We continue to have success in going after poverty. That's where the problem is. That's where the misery lies. I think you should go micro and you should go moral. Micro, let's forget one aggregate. You have to have an aggregate tax rate, but let's forget addressing inequality with the aggregate tax rate. Right? Let's address inequality where people are clearly ripping people off because they have a substantial, perhaps artificial, competitive advantage, where they have a big tariff, where there has been wrongful trading. The Big Short wasn't completely wrong in its analysis. We go after those micro problems. If we see structural problems in the way income is being earned, we try to fix those. If we see unfairnesses there, if we see privilege there that is artificially constructed, then we go after those. And we go moral, right? If you've earned your income, Steve Jobs went from literally zero income when he was on travels in India and gave his last $100 to a friend who got homesick and wanted to go home. So he's in India with zero. When he dies, he has $8 billion. There might have been a little theft in there. There were a couple of antitrust cases against him. By and large, most of that $8 billion is something that he has produced because he has produced products that people want to buy. He's produced good things that people appreciate. So I think we should stick with the moral argument and not go to the macro public finance approach that Piketty favors. Obviously, we should prosecute true theft. In the book, I look at 5 people. Steve Jobs is one of them. Bernie Madoff is another. Nobody thinks, Bernie Madoff actually might have been pro-equality because he stole from even richer people than himself to, right? But I don't think that excuses what he did. And final point, rent-seeking, right? Let's go after rent-seeking. Let's go to Washington, and I don't know if we need to carry pitchforks. There are enough pitchforks there already. But that's where the rent-seeking takes place, and it takes place in state capitals, and it takes place in city governments. It's a natural human trait. Adam Smith recognized it. He predicted it. People want to take care of themselves if they can. What forces them not to is competition, but generally speaking, they would prefer not to have competition. If Piketty retired from book writing, I would not be upset. Right? There would be more room for the rest of us to sell more books as a result of his retirement. But that's the natural desire of every competitor, to have the other competitors disappear. It's to us, the consumers, to go after the rents. I put, with Stiglitz, Fight Rent-Seeking. In Stiglitz's, it's not his latest book because he writes one every 3 weeks, but he has a chapter about, in the book, The Price of Inequality, he has a chapter about the evils of rent-seeking. I got to that chapter in that book and I just about fell over. That's not Stiglitz's argument, rent-seeking. That's our argument, rent-seeking. But if Stiglitz is against privilege and we're against privilege that is artificially constructed, there's a potential, unlikely and probably not very durable, alliance there. I think these arguments about privilege are arguments that people can easily understand and by and large everybody agrees with. We in Stiglitz will disagree about, what's privilege and what's not, what's good privilege and what's bad privilege, but there's at least a potential commonality there that I think it would be useful to. The rest of my story is explained in the book, which you can get on Amazon.com. Thank you.
Well, we will have some time for questions, and we'll do the same thing that we did last, where you'll have, if you wait for the microphone, if you raise your hand, our two lovely ladies will find you and hand you the microphone. And again, as Bert noted, the shorter the questions, the more we can do. But I did want to just talk about Piketty's book for just a second, because some of you were at an event that I spoke at yesterday or day before in Jackson, Mississippi, and I drove down from Hillsdale, and I was listening to the Piketty book on, they used to say on tape, but now it's on whatever it is. But I had to keep turning it off because I was afraid I was going to fall asleep. But so anyway, can we have our first question? Do you have, okay, right here.
Yes, this is partly a question for Scott and perhaps for William too. With regard to the statistics on poverty, were we considering largely earned income or taking welfare benefits into account? And, if we take the welfare benefits into account and also concerned with true poverty, do we look back at that also and look at the moral hazards related to, the welfare benefits and the consequences resulted from that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most of the stats I gave you were fathers' earnings versus sons' earnings. The ones on black-white differences and a few of the other ones were about family income versus sons' or daughters' earnings. And family income includes, just like the Census Bureau definition, cash transfers. I have another big report from the summer that looks at poverty trends and shows when you incorporate non-cash benefits, poverty looks a lot better. Whether that would change the mobility stats, I suspect that wouldn't change them as much. But I think you're right that the disincentives of our safety net programs are probably a part of the story of black-white differences. I had another slide, so I think there's sort of a conservative argument with merit, which is about the safety net and family structure. I think there's a liberal argument with a lot of merit, which is about concentration of poverty and residential segregation. And I think probably, both sides have a piece of the truth.
I think people don't talk about moral hazard, at least not much in Canada and not in this context. But it's kind of obvious, isn't it? If you pay people in their retirement, they may do a little less saving for their retirement. There's a good study by a very good economist, chair at Laval University in Quebec, that looked at the proposal for essentially a guaranteed annual income. And he's a terrific labor economist. And what he and his team found was that if you did provide a guaranteed annual income in Quebec, single poor males would not really experience any increase in income. What would happen is that they would work less. Right? So you wouldn't address poverty. You might raise their utility because they'd have the same income, but they'd be working less. Now, maybe you think if they're working less, that's actually not so good for them. That guy is now the federal minister of social policy. Yeah. So good for him. And there's a smart guy in control. So.
Okay, we have another question. Okay, questions over here.
Okay. This is for Sally, and thank you very much for another excellent presentation. You did one a few years back on Obamacare, so thanks again.
Thank you.
My question is, do you think that a person's worldview impacts the way that they look at the gender wage pay gap argument? Thank you.
I'm not really sure how a person's worldview, I mean, if they're, looking at other countries and things in terms of their career, well, it might. I mean, certainly in countries like the UK, this is becoming more and more an issue about, government saying you have to have equal, put more women on boards of corporations entering into the private sector, which is really worrying. But I think, as women, you look at people, women that head up corporations, whether it's Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, some of these people, they must have a world view, but there's still, a lot of those women in the U.S. in top jobs are very liberal and really are pushing the whole idea of gender equality and are supporting. I mean, Meg Whitman, who ran for governor of California as a Republican, is now standing up saying she really likes Hillary Clinton and she's going to vote for Hillary, and she's actually working to help Hillary get elected.
Yes, we have a question over here.
A double question, please. Being the father of a millennial who are expecting, all the millennials want increased maternity leave for both male and female, sort of a Swedish model. First thing is I'd like to know what your thoughts are about that, what that would do to wage equality or inequality and as far as productivity. And the second question is medical schools, law schools, and colleges are now 55 to 60% women. Do you think, how will you think that will affect wage inequality in the next decade?
Right. So on the issue of the medical schools, the law schools now are in many cases over 50% female. It's going to be interesting to look at the numbers and see, what aspects of medicine or law do these women go into? Because I know a lot of my friends who are female doctors, didn't go into obstetrics or cardiology or neurosurgery. They went into positions like ophthalmology, dermatology that are, that are conducive to having, combining motherhood and work. So, should someone who, there are differences in the salaries paid to people in neurosurgery and dermatology, but I think, if a male neurosurgeon, works longer hours and it's a much more difficult profession than, say, dermatology, then, the men should be paid more and women shouldn't be demanding. I know in law, a lot of the big law firms in the U.S. now are saying, well, you get maternity leave, and a lot of men are upset about it because they don't have paternity leave as of now. So these things are going to have. It's going to be a big issue because I think fewer men in these things. It's really worrying about are women becoming the lead gender in our society, and men and millennials are getting sort of pushed down to the second tier. And what was your first question about the first part of your question? Sorry?
You answered it, but
yeah.
One last thing. There have been studies, I'm a doctor, women over their lifetime only produce 80% of what male doctors produce. Anytime that's stated, you get slapped down immediately as
Discrimination.
discrimination. So it's going to be impossible to actually get true studies. And what makes it even more damaging in a time where we're having more and more people getting older, fastest growing population besides millennials are old people. We're getting more and more women who do only 80% of what a male does over a lifetime. So we're going to have a real medical crisis going on in the next 2 decades.
Right. In addition to the fact that, if we're looking now in the U.S. at the MCAT scores of kids applying to medical schools, the issue is that I think because of Obamacare, not only are a number of docs in this country retiring, 55 to 60 because of all the mandates and the essential benefits and all of that, they're retiring early. But the concern is that the best and the brightest are not applying to medical schools. And this has an impact on the kind of medicine that we're going to get as we get older. And the millennials are not going to be wanting to pay increased taxes. They have no idea when they're not working what this impact this will have.
Okay, we have a question over here.
A question on behalf of Hayek. I grew up in a socialist country with a central distributor of income, and so it made sense for us to talk about wages and inequality and discrimination. Of course, everyone who asked those questions went to jails and labor camps. But I wonder, why do we have to talk about those things here in a capitalist economy, where the consumer is the sovereign distributor?
Well, you have put my 20-minute talk very concisely. And sometimes the consumer is not the distributor. In the U.S. sugar industry, there's substantial protection. As a Canadian, I must say there is protection in the United States. I know you seem not to be aware of that. But, people go to the government and ask for protection. We're very concerned about the Buy America Act, which makes it difficult for our contractors and engineers to get jobs in the U.S. There are lots of other examples. But, I feel that part of the inequality discussion is something we should talk about. It's not because it creates inequality that I find it something to oppose. If it created equality, I would oppose it too. Taxi drivers in Montreal are striking to prevent Uber and from coming into that jurisdiction. And so far, the government has been very supportive of the taxi drivers. Now, the taxi drivers are not high-income people. Some of the people who own the taxi companies are probably fairly high-income people. But I find that something to be very concerned about, whether or not it reduces inequality. So, that's what I mean when I say let's go micro. Let's look at individual cases. Some high-income people, certainly they deserve it. Some high-income people, maybe they don't. Maybe they're running a bit of a scam. Legal scam endorsed in Washington and maybe even codified into law. But I think that's the kind of thing we should be on the lookout for. And, Steve Jobs makes $8 billion providing products that I think are terrific. More power to him. If Thomas Piketty writes a book that even only reading the first chapter people are willing to pay full price for, more power to him. I don't want a government agency to come along and say you must buy Watson's book because he has such pitifully few sales that we have to equalize. Right. And aren't you concerned about the inequality in the author business? I'm concerned about it, but it's a matter of readers' free choice, unfortunately.
Well, Bill, I think that because Canada has 10% of the population of the U.S., you could actually take your 1,400 sales and multiply it by 10, and then you're on your way. You're on your way.
All right, we have time for one more question.
So if it's not so much about mobility and it's not so much about gender gap, then what is causing government leaders to push these issues that don't really exist to any great extent?
Well, so the point of my presentation wasn't that we ought to be satisfied with our levels of economic mobility. I think it's a tough question. People used to ask me, what's the right level of economic mobility? And I said, well, we should be as good as Canada. And now it turns out, based on this new data, that we probably are as good as Canada. So now I'm moving the goalposts. In some sense, I think we ought to be striving to get as much opportunity as we can. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, a world where there's complete statistical mobility is a world where no matter how much you do to get your kids ahead, it's all for naught, right? It gets redistributed at the end. But I do think, especially the black-white differences, to me, is based on a real, clear, historic feature of our country. 400 years of often state-sponsored suppression, I think we do have a responsibility as a nation to figure out how to close that.
Right. Well, please join me in thanking our panel.